Thank you, and welcome to our TeleGeography's 17th or perhaps 18th annual Sunday afternoon workshop at PTC. My name is Tim. I'm here with my colleagues Brianna and Jon, and we have 3 different presentations to go over with you today. To start us off, it's going to be Brianna. If you judge things by the number of photos per slide taken by the audience, hers is probably the most popular at PTC that I've witnessed. She always goes over pricing trends that we're seeing, and she's going to launch us off. And speaking of photos, if you're interested in the slides, unfortunately they're going to be a little bit too large for us to email you afterwards. But if you want to take a screen grab of this it'll send you to a website where you just enter your name and your email address, and you can go there Tuesday or perhaps as early as tomorrow, and the slides will be available for you to download if you want to study anything further after the presentation. Also, one quick housekeeping note. We're scheduled to go for 2 different sessions broken up by a 15-minute break in the middle. But we know that you guys have a lot of things on your plate in the afternoon, so what we want to do for you is to speed through. We're going to go through that coffee break, but we're going to end well earlier than the 3:45 scheduled time, so that you can go out and see other presentations or go watch the end of a playoff game, whatever you want to do. Brianna is going to be first, as I said. Secondly, it'll be me that'll be presenting something a little bit different. Usually I talk about submarine cables, certainly touching on cables, but a much more broader thing to talk about. We're going to be talking about geography, about how to rank the world's cities in terms of the most attractive for telecom hubs. And finally, Jon will come behind me attempting to undo some of the damage that I've done, talking about what's actually happening in the data center market. So thanks very much for being here. I want to hand things off to Brianna.
All right, thank you, Tim, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. As Tim mentioned, I'm going to be going through some of our latest findings from our pricing research and tackling some of the most common questions that we've received over the past year. And if any of you thought you were going to get out of PTC without at least one Taylor Swift reference, I'm sorry, but here at the TeleGeography Tour, we are solidly in our pricing era. So what are we going to cover today? Well, last year we found ourselves in uncharted territory. Delays in new supply had dramatically slowed price erosion around the world and had a lot of us asking, are prices actually increasing? So today we'll ask, are we out of the woods yet? Has price erosion returned to normal? And how do those trends compare across regions? How is 400G demand and pricing models rolled out worldwide? What has been the impact of all these transport trends on the transit market? And where are we headed in our next era? So first, are we out of the woods yet? Wavelength price declines are nothing new to many of you in this room. And over the past 3 years, 100G prices across key global routes continued to decrease about 13% on average. Now, we certainly saw a range in price erosion trends, from just 2% on Marseille-Singapore, that lovely flat turquoise line there in the middle, to 29% on Miami-Sao Paulo, featured here in the red. But their bigger story is, despite these declines, it's still a dramatically slower pace than we're used to seeing in the market. Here we've mapped out 100G wavelength CAGR price declines from 2017 to 2020 in those turquoise bars versus 2020 to 23 in the dark blue. As you can see, it's dramatically slower across all of these routes. Whereas 2017 to 2020, we saw a 30% decline. It's just that average of 13% now. And there's a few factors at play here. These are already very competitive subcable routes, and 100G prices are already low, potentially without not a lot of room left to fall. But also, we're still seeing delays in new network supply on a lot of these routes. Yes, card shortages and supply chain disruptions have resolved themselves, but we're still seeing some of those geopolitical issues, such as those in the Red Sea, the South China Sea, that are delaying new network projects on some of these routes, and that's led to more muted price erosion. But the impact hasn't been the same throughout every region, so we're going to take a deeper dive into a few examples here. Routes to and within Asia have been particularly impacted by these supply chain disruptions. Here we featured 100G wavelength prices in those dark blue columns and CAGR price decline over the past 3 years in those red dots. As you can see across these key routes, prices decreased just 6% annually over the past 3 years. And that's really amplified some price differences within the Pacific and within Asia itself. And even around the world, more modest rates of price erosion have maintained or even amplified global price differences. Here I've mapped out 100G wavelength prices relative to London, New York. So London, New York is that green line down there at the bottom. And as you can see, starting in about 2020, the middle of this figure, going all the way to the right, as we saw price erosion stall, those differences became more amplified. Today, Marseille, Singapore is about 4.3 times the price of London, New York. LA, Tokyo is still hovering at about 2.7 times the price. The one route to buck that trend, that's Miami, Sao Paulo. There in the turquoise. That's gone from about 6.9 times the price in 2018 to just 2.8 times the price today. Now, as we've said in previous presentations, we never expect to see a universal global price due to differences in underlying costs and demand levels, but we have come to expect some convergence, and that just hasn't been happening. But again, not every route has been impacted in the same way. And on routes where we've seen new systems come online, upgrades to existing systems, price erosion has started to return to historic levels. Here we featured routes to Africa, which have seen the RFS of the Peace and Equiano cables in the past year. And here, 100G prices decreased 26%, compounded annually. Similarly, within Latin America, it's not a region that's been want for supply recently. 100G prices decreased an average of 34% annually. And all these routes featured here are also anticipating the launch of the Fermina cable in early 2024. Again, lack of supply isn't going to last forever. We certainly are seeing a lot of new investment coming down the pike within the next few years. Here we've mapped out total cable construction costs by region, and 2023 to 2025 is the turquoise part of these bars here. So you see on routes to and within Asia, highlighted by those red boxes, there's a substantial amount of new investment that is ready to come into the market, over $5 billion in the next few years. And this is just a map view of where those cables are going to be hitting. It's not just the traditional hubs of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo, but a lot of those secondary markets that we've been talking about the last few years here at PTC, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. So a lot of diversity in where these systems are going. So, are we out of the woods yet? Not entirely. While global supply chain disruptions and card shortages have resolved themselves, geopolitical issues remain, and they're still delaying some new network projects. And fewer cables with inventory at one time has led to less competitive price pressure. But on routes where we have seen recent upgrades, new supply, and pre-sales on new systems, that price erosion is returning to higher levels. And there's a lot of new investment coming into Asia with the next few years, so we should see that trend expand. But in the meantime, uncertainty on the timeline of future supply on some routes has changed customer purchasing patterns. Supply is being snatched up before it becomes available or bought in bulk. So even if upgrades are happening, that capacity may already be spoken for. Customers are taking capacity at the price that is offered, and that's helping to maintain price points. So in this next section, we'll take a look at 400G. One common question we've received multiple times this year is, how is demand for the service shaping up? What are pricing models looking like worldwide? So here we've mapped out 400G MRC prices in those dark blue columns, and the price multiple from 100 to 400G in those red dots. We've heard that uptake has been slower than initially anticipated, although it is picking up, and as a result, there's only a slight discount still between 100 and 400G. Lower multiples are seen on those shorter terrestrial routes within Europe and within the US. Our average multiple across those routes sits at about 3.5, although recently we've heard as low as 2.5 to 3 times the price. So there is some movement there as demand is picking up. On subsea routes, the multiples remain a little bit higher, averaging about 3.9 times the price across the Atlantic and Pacific. But if history is any guide, we don't expect those multiples to hold, and as demand picks up, they should compress over time. Here we've mapped out the evolution of 10 to 100G price multiples. As you can see in 2016 in the dark blue, that multiple was a lot higher. 100G was 6.5 times the price of 10, whereas in 2023, we are down to about 4 times the price. So uptake, while it has been slow so far, sales limited to shorter terrestrial routes within Europe and the US, Asia and Oceania demand is pretty limited as well. And as a result, there's only been a slight discount between 100 and 400G. We've heard those lower multiples starting to come on the terrestrial routes as demand picks up, and we expect that to transfer to subsea routes as well once that demand is there. But it's not just about the price multiple. There are additional savings to be made on install, cross-connect charges, and power consumption that could be compelling for some buyers to make that leap. So how have these transport trends impacted the transit market? Well, last year, our data suggested that the supply scarcity and inflationary pressure on network equipment costs had also muted IP transit pricing erosion. That is no longer the case. IP transit prices returned to a trend that we do know all too well, decreasing about 17% across these key global cities over the past 3 years. Again, we did see a range in that, from just 5% declines in Singapore to 33% in Sao Paulo. But really, that average of 17% is well within the 15 to 20% annual erosion that we've come to expect to see within the market. Here again, I've highlighted the 2017 to 2020 CAGR for 10 gig IP transit ports versus 2020 to 2023. And while still a little bit slower in many cities, it is picking up and coming back towards historical levels. The biggest declines that we've seen over the past year are in those historically transport-dependent markets, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo. If you remember just a few slides ago, they saw some pretty big cuts in transport pricing over the past few years, and that's reflected in lower transit prices as well. In addition, these are cities that are positioning themselves as regional hubs for traffic exchange. There's been a lot of carrier network investment. More content is being hosted locally, and that's reduced their dependence on those expensive long-haul links, lowering transit prices. And just one more caveat before we leave this slide, that Singapore decline, which looks very slow at the top of this figure compared to historical trends. If you look at the underlying data, we've seen a number of carriers make some pretty big price cuts over the past year, suggesting that things are starting to get back to normal in Asia as well. And across the board within Asia, transit prices continue to steadily decline at an average of about 20% compounded annually over the past 3 years. We've seen the biggest reductions in those secondary markets, such as Malaysia and Manila, which really have been a focus of new network investment. Stubbornly high prices still in India and Indonesia, but there is a lot of investment going in there as well. And some of those higher rates of price erosion have started reducing the premium in secondary markets compared to hubs of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo. Here I've mapped out 10 gigi IP transit prices relative to Singapore. So Singapore is that dark line there at the bottom. As you can see, we've started to see some convergence in these markets. For example, Manila is just 4.7 times the price of Singapore now, but that's compared to 6.5 just a few years ago. Similarly, Thailand is 4.4 times the price compared to 6. So we are seeing that convergence in those markets. And while 10 gigi still represents a large portion of the IP transit market, we are seeing rapid uptake of 100 gigi ports in many of the world's international network hubs. And across these key cities, 100 gigi port prices decreased an average of about 17% annually over the past 3 years. That leaves 100 gig port prices at about 7.2 times the price of a 10 at the end of this year. And while that multiple seems high, as we just discussed with transport, it's not the entire story. Shifting to 100 gig ports also reduces the complexity of managing multiple ports, the cost of cross connects as well. So in this figure, we've tried to map this out. That turquoise line in the middle represents the cost of 100 gig port plus the cost of a fiber cross connect in New York City. That dark blue line represents the corresponding number of 10 gig ports. So at what point might it make sense for customers to make that leap? Well, it is about after 5 10 gig ports. So if you look at the total picture, it often makes sense for customers now to make that leap a little bit earlier than just looking at port prices would suggest. So IP transit prices continue to decline at a steady pace. In established hubs, those declines are enabled by escalating volumes and lower unit costs. In secondary markets, they're being driven by reductions in the underlying cost of transport and increasingly local traffic exchange. 100 gig ports are rapidly seeing uptake in many of the world's key hubs, and while price multiples remain high, there are savings on install, cross-connects, and ease of management that may be compelling factors for people to make that leap. So where are we headed in our next era? Will price erosion return to normal, or is there a new normal? While supply chain constraints are largely resolved, there are some other issues delaying new network projects. But we have seen on those routes, once those new systems come online, price erosion has started to return to historical levels. We're also approaching an era of cable retirements, which could change the competitive landscape. While some providers have announced new projects that they're investing in, others have not. And that could change the number of bandwidth suppliers on some routes and impact pricing trends. We've also seen a lot of people start to do the math on when does it make sense to purchase a fiber pair or spectrum versus leasing wavelengths. Fiber pair pricing is very cable specific, and it's not subject to the same pricing trends we're used to and usually discuss at this workshop. So that's something to consider as well. And finally, we expect more local market growth for IP transit pricing. Historically, it's been more cost effective for customers in some markets like Africa or Latin America to buy transport to Europe or the US and exchange traffic or access content there. But increasingly, that's not the case anymore. There's more content being hosted locally, more neutral venues for traffic exchange, more providers opening POPs. And so we're seeing more regional hubs open, creating more cost-effective and also better performing IP transit services for local customers. So I'm going to welcome Tim up to the stage.
Thank you, Brianna. Just to be clear, the italicized elements of your presentation, were they all names of Taylor Swift songs? Okay, very, very clever. The industry has some really well-known Swifties. Brian Lavallee, I know, is Eric Contag. I could see them really digging that presentation for that reason. Nice job. Okay, I'm going to try something a little different, actually a lot different from what I usually do. Usually I try to present you with data and analysis that's been really well vetted and polished and peer reviewed. That's not the case right now. We're in the middle of a project that's just now reaching what you might call a functional alpha stage, something we're calling the Interconnection Index. And it's designed to answer some questions that we found very difficult to answer, to quantify in the past. It all has to do with what are hubs in the world. One of the advantages of, or one of the benefits of going to PTC, after a certain time, you get to wear reading glasses. They let you. A common question is, what is the next emerging hub in X region? You've probably heard that one a lot, especially Asia. But how do you quantify that? What data can you bring to bear on that question? How do various hubs in the world compare with each other? For example, I have to invest in, put a POP in the Mediterranean region. Which is better, Marseille or Milan? Or, heard this one quite a bit, I'm invested in the primary city. I have a POP in the primary city in some country, but what are the second and third cities I should push into now? So it's impossible really to have a one-size-fits-all model that would answer appropriately all those questions. But we're dumb enough to kind of try. How we're going to address this issue is with data, and because we're geography geeks, of course, we're going to pull in some maps. So our first map is all the blue dots are metropolitan areas that TeleGeography tracks. There are about 8,200 of them that we've collected data on for some reason or another. And by metro area, I mean an agglomeration of cities. So Washington, D.C. would be one metro area. We're not counting all the individual elements in Northern Virginia, District of Columbia, and Maryland. It's one. But because I'm lazy, I might mix up the terms metro and cities later on, but just setting it up. Okay, let's talk about the framework for how we're going to try to address this. First of all, we're collecting large groups of data sets within different categories. There's some obvious ones that we can start with. Data center build in a metro area, for example. That's pretty straightforward. How many data centers are there? How much power do they collectively account for? What's the gross floor space? How many new data centers are planned for that region? And we can do the same for internet exchange points in a metro area, several data sets there. But it's not just local infrastructure we want to look at, right? If you want to measure how important a city is, whether it's a hub or not. We also want to look at how well that city or metro area connects to other cities. So we can look at cloud infrastructure there, how many cloud regions, on-ramps, and so forth. Long-distance internet, how much internet capacity goes into that place. Transport. If it's a coastal city, how many submarine cables does it have close proximity to? Or how many transport carriers are there? And pricing. How low is pricing? So that's the sort of one of the ones that's a bit of an inverse. High prices are bad, low prices are good for this index. But we don't want to just measure local infrastructure and city-to-city telecom kind of infrastructure, but a lot of carriers or CDNs or anyone who cares about end users also wants to know about the local market potential. So some data sets there: geography, demographics, local access, how many mobile subscribers are in a city, of those how many have 4G and 5G. And then some data sets that TeleGeography doesn't currently collect, but we've found some pretty interesting third-party ones. Power, electricity. I've got some fun maps later on that I want to share with you on that. And also, something that's quite difficult to quantify, the quality of regulations in different places. That really is important. I'll also talk about that. Okay, so that's a theoretical framework. Let's talk about a practical working example. I randomly picked Osaka, Japan, for this example. So within the geography and demographics group, we have GDP per capita. It's 39.7 K, and population 12.8 million. And because a hub just serves not just itself but nearby cities, what's the population of nearby cities within a certain radius? But you probably will see an immediate problem. How do you compare effectively across different units? How do you compare GDP per capita in one city with population in another? To do that, we have to normalize it. And we're normalizing things on a score, everything of 0 to 100. How are we doing that? The smallest city in our data set is a little hamlet that some carrier had a pop in, that population of 500. The largest city is Shanghai, or largest metropolitan area, Shanghai, 32.2 million. Osaka sits at 39.8% in between the min and max ranges there. So it gets a normalized score for this one little category of 39.8. Overall, in this group, it's a simple average of 27.6. And we do the same thing for cloud infrastructure. How many local zones, on-ramps, regions, planned regions? It gets a score of 28.3. And then we can go and do that through dozens of different data sets. And at the end, if you average them all up, a very simple average is 39.6. Now alone, that's not terribly meaningful. What's that mean? I'm 39.6, well, congratulations. But it is meaningful when you start comparing one metro to another. A 39.6 rating or score is good for 19th in the world. That's where Osaka lands. So you might be thinking one of two things right now. One is, hey, I didn't realize there was going to be any math involved in this. I'm sorry about that, but we're through with the boring part. We're on to the cool infographics and the results of the model. On the other hand, you might be thinking, man, I want more of this. I want not just Osaka, but all 8,200 in the world and every single data set. So I thought you might. So I took a screenshot of 600,000. So feel free to take a photo now and study it later if you want to. Okay. Now we come to the more fun part, which is the actual model outputs. We've done all the math, and at least initially at this stage of the interconnection index, which is probably going to change, but for now, what are the top 5 scoring cities in the world? Maybe you can be thinking about what you think would be. First of all, number 5 is an American city. Guesses what that city is? What's that? Los Angeles is an excellent guess. It is incorrect. But you get bonus points. You're the first to guess. And it's pretty close. Not New York. Another great guess. It is not Chicago. It is Washington. I'll actually talk about in a moment why Washington scores so highly in this index, but it's 5th in the world. Okay, we're on a roll here. What's the 4th? I know it's tiny, and maybe you don't even recognize the flag. I'll give you a hint, it's a city-state, and it's not the Vatican. It's Singapore is number 4. Number 4 in the world is Singapore. Number 3 is another Asian city. It is in Japan, and you already know it's not Osaka. It's Tokyo, is the 3rd best connected hub in the world. 2nd, okay, you guys can get this one. German city, Frankfurt. Frankfurt it is. All right, you know 2 through 5, what's the best? What's number 1 right now? Amsterdam, I think, is 6. It's a good guess. It is a European city. It flies the Union Jack. It's Manchester. Kidding. It is the city of London, or the metropolitan area of London. I should be specific there. Okay, that's just top level ranking. That's the top of the pyramid. But when you start digging down a little bit, it's also important to know that the shape of a city also matters. Hey, Brianna, do you know the Taylor Swift song, "The Shape of a City's Interconnection Assets Matters Too"? Yeah. You know it though, right, Brian? Yeah. It's one of her darker, more introspective works. Yeah, so just picking a number is not terribly meaningful. London is number 1. Okay, what's that mean? Why is it number 1? If you start breaking out why it scores so highly, then it becomes more interesting. And it's particularly important for people in the industry because not everyone has the same needs. A company that's investing in AI and wants to find a place to train its models really cares about lots of power and potentially renewable power. But a CDN may want to know where the end users are. So where does London do well? So London here is the dark blue line, or dark blue shape. Here, let me see if I can do this. Yeah, here we go. On the eastern side, or right side of this chart, the further out you go, the better you are, okay? So you can see on the east side are telecom infrastructure things, data centers, internet exchanges, pricing, and on the west side measures more of the market potential of a metro area. So London does particularly well in pricing, long-distance transport, and it has very stable regulations as a whole compared to most places in the world. So this becomes more interesting when you can overlay other cities. I picked another metro area that also scores very, very highly. London was number 1 in the world. Beijing was 11. So they score very closely, but how they got there is radically different. Beijing, the 2 areas it does better, number of data centers, the sheer scale of the data center market is larger in Beijing. And power, the installed base of nearby electricity generation plants is at roughly double in Beijing compared to London, even though they're roughly the same size in terms of population. Okay, those are the 2 areas where Beijing surpasses London. Where does London surpass Beijing? Why is it number 1 and not number 11? Well, a few things really jumped out at me. Internet exchanges and long-distance transport. London is far superior. And really, in some ways, that reflects, going way back in time, the command economy aspects of the Chinese market. And it still, in some ways, is very hierarchical, that's served by 3 basically giant companies. And you're not expected to go to an internet exchange and peer with hundreds of different ASs as you are in London. Because of the fierce competition in London, you can see that prices are lower. That means, in our score, it's better. Prices are lower in London. Another area that I'm going to talk about in a moment is regulations and governance. If you're a private enterprise, all things being equal, you're more likely to have better luck starting a business or expanding your business in London than you are trying to move into Beijing. All right, here's another one. I mentioned Washington was on this list. Why is this number 5? A couple of ways that Washington is outstanding. The data center market has the most data center space in the world for any metro area. It's about equal to Beijing in the overall data center market. and cloud infrastructure. It's a real leader in the cloud. London is not for Europe. There are other European metro areas that are stronger for cloud infrastructure. Long-distance transport, though, Washington, D.C. is not an international hub for the United States. You mentioned Los Angeles. That is a better hub for long-distance transport than D.C. So is New York. So is Miami compared to Washington. And London exceeds D.C. in terms of end users, local access. There are more people. There are roughly 4 times more people in London than the D.C. metro area. So we can do this again for lots of different hubs, and you start seeing interesting patterns. This legend is just the London area, just to remind you of what goes where. Remember, on the right is infrastructure, telecom infrastructure. The left is end user market potential. I'm showing the top 3 hubs for every region according to the current iteration of this interconnection index. It may change tomorrow because it's still in active development. And I could really geek out and talk for 10 minutes about this one chart, but just a few simple observations. One is that the smaller hubs tend to have spikier shapes, star-like shapes. And that's because they're really good in 1 or 2 aspects, but they're not as universally strong. Tel Aviv is a really good example. Compared to most parts in the world, all things being equal, it has fairly stable governance and low prices. But its data center market is really nascent. It's just now getting off the ground. In comparison, some of the higher scoring regions of the world are well-rounded. Literally, their shapes are rounded. It's because they do a lot of things well. Tokyo, Singapore, Frankfurt, London, even Sao Paulo. These are areas that are compelling for investment for a lot of reasons. Okay, that's looking at a snapshot of where things are right now. The fun thing about this is we can also take some of the metrics that are more forward-looking and see how things might be changing in the next couple of years. Things like announced data center builds, announced cloud regions, even where electricity generation sites are going in. So what are the metro areas that we think are going to be changing the fastest in the next 20 years? I plotted the 20 of them. I'm calling out a few of them. One is Beijing. An awful lot of data center and cloud infrastructure investment has already been announced for that area. Madrid really surprised me, but there's cloud and data center growth there. Also, I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but in Spain, there's a massive solar plant being planned. So that helps push up its score. Kuala Lumpur. We often hear about Singapore maxing out pretty soon. Kuala Lumpur is growing quite a bit. That could be a secondary market. We're also asked what's growing in the Middle East. This one surprised me. I thought it would be Dubai. It's actually Riyadh. In Riyadh, there are 2 new cloud regions being planned. And a few other interesting ones. Fortaleza, some data center growth there, and some huge wind farms that are being planned for that area. I believe collectively, if they're built, 53 gigawatts. I don't speak in gigawatts. I don't speak in watts. I speak in bits. So I had to convert it. Hoover Dam has a potential to generate 2 gigawatts. And so the largest hydro plant in the world right now is at 20. So 53 is a lot. And Santiago also, a lot of growth we're seeing there. Okay, let me shift in the last few slides here, talking about some things that TeleGeography doesn't collect. So far, that was all TeleGeography data. Let's talk about laws. Laws do matter, especially if you attended the session earlier today, you talked about how difficult permitting could be. There is an interesting effort to try to quantify this country by country that's pulled together by the World Bank. They call it the Worldwide Governance Indicators set of metrics. That's essentially an agglomeration of different think tanks' views and perceptions of the quality of laws and how consistently they're managed in different places. What I've done here is ranked from top to bottom different hubs in Asia. These aren't the top hubs, but these are some of the top hubs from top to bottom, and then shown you the scores for this. I've normalized it 0 to 100, and I've color-coded. Dark green is good, yellow and orange is bad. So just a few observations. Tokyo, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to the audience, but it's a stable government. Singapore, excellent government, very transparent regulations for the most part, but compared to a lot of cities you might experience, say, in Western Europe, it's philosophically not necessarily the same adherence to freedom of individual expression that you would see in Europe. So it doesn't score as well in the voice and accountability. So if you're concerned perhaps about, well, actually, I'll just move on from there. But South Korea scores highly. At the bottom, just for the fun of it, I put in Darwin. Now, it's not a major hub. It doesn't score highly in our interconnection index right now. But there has been talk about using Darwin because of its proximity to Asia as a secondary hub. And you can see clearly one of the reasons why. It's the stable and clear laws in Australia. What are some areas that are problematic? Beijing, obviously, this is not a surprise. The one red area is the voice and accountability, freedom of expression. But control of corruption is a concern, especially if you're a private enterprise looking to invest in a hub. Jakarta has been considered, some places in Indonesia. It at least has the perception of that being a difficult area. And Manila as well. Manila, because of the perception of inconsistent rule of law and control of corruption, scores about as badly as Beijing does. I can't vouch for all of the index, but I thought these were some interesting observations. Now I want to shift from talking about political power to a different kind of power, and that's electricity. This is where we can really geek out about maps. So this is really fun, I think. There's another data set that I've linked here that plots out, or that gives the coordinates and data on every individual plant in the world. What I've done is plotted this where they are, color-coded it by source of generation, the type of fuel that's being used, and sized it by the how large that facility might be. I do want to caution that, you know, the submarine cable world, there's a lot of aspirational cables that are announced that never get built. It's pretty clear that some of these are highly aspirational and they're not going to be built anytime soon. But it's still pretty neat to talk about. What I want to do is let you guess again what the colors are. These are new builds. It's a little difficult to see. What do you think is the source of fuel that's fueling what I've color-coded brown? And I will give you a hint. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, and quote a former United States president. When I say blank, he was talking about the fuel. He said, "I just left Montana, and I looked at those trains, and they're loaded with clean blank. Beautiful, clean blank." So a voice over there answered already, it is coal. I was surprised to see that anyone is building coal plants, but they are happening on a fairly small scale, quite a bit in China. Another problematic source of fuel, if you're concerned about CO2 emissions, which a lot of corporations increasingly are. Any guesses where this is? Some of the larger ones are planned for Southeast Asia, as you can see. Where do you think is the gold color? Exactly. This is natural gas, probably, yeah. So this is the source of generation is gas. Now we're going to talk about renewables. This is where things get really massive, some really ambitious plans. This, I don't know what color, fuchsia color. Guesses what this is? This surprised me. That's right. It's easier to see if you can zoom in. You can see offshore, northeast United States. Zoom in, North Sea. These are all planned sites. Some huge renewable generation from wind. There's one in Australia that I don't know if it's ever going to get built, but if built, it would generate between 25 and 50 gigawatts on its own. And the field that they've allocated for this is 15,000 kilometers square, which is 10 times the size of Oahu. It's a lot. It's a lot of power. So if you're concerned about power, if you need to get some, you want it clean, wind is an obvious source. Okay, just a couple more. What do you think is the blue one? What's that? Hydro, that's right. There's a huge one in China that would be 60 gigawatts, Motuo, I believe it's called. That's not planned for even 2045. So some of these are way far out on this map. Can anyone guess what country is home to the largest hydro plant actually under construction right now? You're not going to guess this one. I don't think you are. Okay, the Swifty is close. Where in Africa, Smarty? It's on the Nile. It's in Ethiopia. I believe the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Hydro Project, 5.2 gigawatts. Pretty impressive in scale. And finally, what is the source of fuel for this, source of energy for this? Solar, yes. Some really big ones planned for solar as well. So my last few slides talk about weighting, and I'm going to pull power into this. You may have recalled that I explained earlier the interconnection index has a simple average of all these. But one thing may not be equal of importance to you. So I'm going to show you here, first of all, these are some selected hubs ranked by default order with just using a simple average of different metros in the world. But what if power is really important to you? What if you need a lot of power for whatever reason and you really wanted to make sure that it's renewable? Does that change the rankings at all? Sure does. Okay, that was the before, this is the after. Like Frankfurt, Tokyo, and especially Singapore really fall in the rankings. Beijing goes to number 1 or actually number 2 in the world, I believe, because of this. A lot of the solar plants planned in that area. Madrid really jumps up. Singapore falls because only 2% of its power is from clean sources. Whereas look at Stockholm. This is the before. This is after for Stockholm. It really surges. 91% of its power is from clean sources. So weighting does matter. And really, that's just a pitch, because I wanted to present this to you guys because I know that you're amongst the smartest and well-informed audience that I have a chance to speak in front of. So I wanted to say that I really need your help. If you have other data sets that you think need to be added to this, please come afterwards and tell me. And if you have opinions on how we should rank things, how we should weight things, I'd love to hear your opinion. That would be very helpful. And I also want to give one caveat that this is obviously a fairly shallow, even though we're going through dozens of data sets, it's a shallow way approach. So this is a first step towards investment. This is not the final say. You need a little more nuance in some of the analysis. And to provide that nuance, I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Mr. Jon Hjembo. Thank you, Jon.
All right, thanks, Tim. That was terrific. So in the next few minutes, as we talk about the data center market, I want us to think about this general theme of exploration here. So we got the data center market blazing a new trail. When we think about exploration or the pioneering spirit, you can think about both positive and negative factors that propel that kind of movement, right? So it could be the excitement of new opportunity, or it could be the pressures of difficulties where you are that are forcing you to leave to an uncertain future. I think that the data center market is kind of dealing with some of both of those sorts of impulses right now, impelling them to move forward to new places. So I want to tie a couple of themes together in talking about this today. First, I want to look at a geographical example of this pioneering spirit and talk about what we see happening in the APAC region in particular right now, because I think it's a really good example of this. And then I want to look at two factors, both power and the increasing sense of urgency in finding new sources of power, and cost as potential factors in driving the market forward to new places. So let's start by looking at the APAC frontier. So if we go back over the last 5-year period, we've already seen a shift, right? So we're looking at the 5-year growth in the aggregate capacity in these major APAC hubs. Since the moratorium in Singapore, new growth has pretty much dropped off. It really only the few projects that had been approved prior to the moratorium snuck through before the new licensing regime took root. If you look on the opposite side, we've already seen just staggering growth in new capacity in Mumbai, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. That extends beyond Mumbai, really to the nation as a whole. And Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta, as much as we've been talking about new Southeast Asian places to deploy new infrastructure, that's already been happening too. And so let's look at what the trajectory looks like going forward. A few of these slightly decreasing, comparing the historical growth to the future growth. Singapore drops even further. And well, of course, that depends too on the rollout timelines for the projects that have been approved under the new licensing regime. But that's significant because here we have by far the most critical market in Southeast Asia, and there's just no way to get new facilities built other than this very limited approval process. Mumbai drops a little bit in terms of its growth over the next 3 years, but it's still very large. And in fact, if we look at India as a whole, it's third only to the US and China when we think about the number of projects in the pipeline. So we see a tremendous growth across the country, and it goes from east to west, Mumbai, or west to east, Mumbai all the way to Chennai and everywhere in between, Kolkata, and up particularly in the capital region of New Delhi as well. So tremendous growth there. And if we look at Southeast Asia, that's going even further. And we have a number of international operators entering some of these markets for the first time and converging all at once. What's interesting, particularly with Malaysia, is that as relations between China and the West are kind of icing over a bit, we see a convergence of Chinese and US operators and other international operators in Malaysia in particular, with multiple projects being developed. But Indonesia as well, significant numbers of new projects. But so the overall capacity growth that we see happening is perhaps higher in Jakarta over the next few years. Kuala Lumpur, more projects, particularly across the nation of Malaysia. It's interesting to see what's happening in North Asia as well. Traditionally, Japan has been, even though it's absolutely one of the world's biggest markets, it's also a hard market to get into. A lot of the growth that happens in Japan is specifically because of the various entities of NTT. But then there are other local providers and then certainly some major international footprints. But we're starting to see new international development coming in through Air Trunk Stack STT and numerous others for the first time. That's kind of a new phenomenon, despite the fact that it's actually hard to find suitable land in this market. Seoul has traditionally been challenging too, primarily there because of backhaul from subsea to the capital area. But nonetheless, Digital Realty, Equinix, Stack, STT, all moving in all at once. So I think what's particularly interesting here before moving on is that while we see opportunities for new growth kind of slowing down significantly in Singapore and also in Hong Kong, we see this tremendous surge of growth driven by local companies, joint ventures, and international players happening all at once in multiple areas of Asia, from North Asia to Southeast to India. I want to take a moment and talk about what's going on in China too. Again, with Hong Kong, the primary hub in this region. The growth has slowed there significantly, coinciding with the protests that happened in 2019 and the actions taken thereafter. In the meantime, growth already historically in the last couple of years has been surging going into the mainland, particularly in the capital area and the Yangtze Delta area. And again, this is going to continue even more, looking at what's planned in the pipeline going forward. If you've heard of the Chinese policy, Eastern Data, Western Compute, there's a mandate to set up multiple zones of data center interconnection. The East being primarily devoted to low latency applications for access to high population markets. The Western zones being set up for storage in areas with more abundant and cheaper power. So in the eastern zones, there's tons of development happening right now in the capital area, in the Yangtze Delta area, and then the greater Bay Area with Shenzhen and Guangzhou significantly, not so much including Hong Kong. All right, so we see that as the Hong Kong gateway status becomes more uncertain, China is moving inward in its development. So if, for some of you in the US, maybe you've seen this Salesforce ad going around. You got Matthew McConaughey, and he's standing there in this old West town, and he's kind of musing. If AI is the Wild West, does that make data the new gold? And the ad goes on to say that your data is your data is not our product. So it's a good ad, it's an effective one, but I would propose to you today that, in fact, in the era of AI, power is very much the new gold. And we've seen lots of estimates about the amount used by data centers. They've come under a lot more scrutiny. This is just our estimate, and then one of many. If you look at just this handful of markets here, consuming 12 gigawatts of power just for roughly 1,000 data centers in these markets, that's the equivalent of what it takes to power about 9 million homes. We already have a scarcity problem. Before generative AI took off in the last year, we were already dealing with a crisis of looking for power. And these are just some of the big examples right here. But this is, so basically now the industry is on the radar internationally, rightly or wrongly or both. There's definitely been criticism about the amount of power used by data centers. And so as some regulatory things take effect, now we have a situation where the data center market turns around and says, well, you know what, actually, we're going to need a whole lot more power, not less. With the arrival of generative AI and the amount of power required for training and for inference, we're going to see a whole lot more demand. So what does this do to our sense of where we need to be, and how tethered can we possibly be to core markets that are already constrained when we need so much more power? Just looking at NVIDIA's latest GPU chips, for example, the H100 and H200, their thermal design power is 700 watts for a chip, and that's the equivalent of what a lot of cloud servers actually use. Taking that example further, NVIDIA GPUs would require about 45 to 80 kilowatts for a 42U rack. From our latest survey, we see that a vast majority of sites can't even support 20 kilowatts per rack. If you look at this like globally, and very few racks could even, or very few sites could even come close to supporting the amount of power needed here. So what does this mean in terms of where we need to go moving forward in terms of searching for power? There's still a lot of debate as to how far you can possibly be from the major population centers with your AI data centers. There's two aspects, of course, training and inference. And for the training, it seems that the consensus is that you don't have to be quite as close to where ultimately these applications are going to be used. So it gives you a little bit more leeway to go to areas with slightly higher latency, areas with cheaper and more abundant power. So that could certainly drive data center demand in markets that are a little further out from the urban centers. But for inference, for the actual workloads, they're going to have to be close to the end users. And because of that, we're going to see even more demand for power going forward in places where we already have a capacity drought. So what do we see happening so far in terms of how operators are responding to the challenges of this situation? Well, certainly we see operators very, very carefully choosing where they decide to go and figuring out who they can possibly partner with in those locations in order to get access to the power they need. And I think a particularly poignant recent example has been AWS moving close to the Ashburn market, which is, of course, very power constrained right now. And instead going to Louisa County, Virginia, and working with the Rappahannock Cooperative to gain access to their power plant, their nuclear power plant generation. So we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that, moving to areas that are fairly close to where the major data center markets are, but finding areas where you can use alternate utility partners and alternate sources of energy. Conversion is a possibility, and it's something that has been very actively deployed or explored in some markets where access to utility power is really challenging to get. This is an expensive solution. It requires having mini-gen equipment on site to convert gas to electricity, but that's something that's been explored on some level. But I wanted to touch on this last one, making use of waste heat. In the case of Germany, it's being mandated under the new Energy Efficiency Act that operators share waste heat with their local communities. And what's intriguing about this option is that it kind of takes away some of the sense that we are all competing for power with other entities, and rather we can work together with other parts of our local economy to help make best use of our resources. All right, so moving on to high costs as a potential pressure point. Now, the data center industry is notoriously sticky. So just because costs are higher in a market doesn't mean that people are suddenly going to flee. But there are examples of this. And actually, I found this really, this nice example of people fleeing one market and going to another one because of high costs. And in fact, this is probably a little outdated because I think that the tech workers have already started fleeing Austin as well. But let's look at energy prices first. Now, while energy prices are not completely don't move in complete concert with co-location costs, they're certainly relevant because they're the highest component. They're one of the most critical components of underlying co-location costs. So if we look at wholesale energy rates, when the crisis happened with the war in Ukraine, we saw a massive increase in rates before going down again slightly in the most recent periods. But the prices for power have kind of rested at a much higher level than they were a couple of years ago, back in 2019. The interesting exception there is the US, which has been kind of buffered from some of the effects of this. I shared this slide last year too, but in looking at power costs, I think it's important to look at power because of how critical it is to the overall cost of co-location. But it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a direct correlation between the movements in co-location and energy costs. And that's because of factors like these. There can be lag effects in the co-location market because of energy contracts by the data center operator. There could be pass-through contracts where energy rate fluctuations are passed directly on to the customer, or rolling increases where they're a little bit buffeted from that. And one of the things that we also see quite a bit is kind of hiding some of the cost increases so that it doesn't look like you're being as exposed to the full energy volatility by moving some of that increase into things like cross-connects. So let's look at co-location prices in that regard. On the left, there's some descriptions on a regional level, some individual market examples on the right. So we've definitely seen a a rise in European rates and Asian rates, particularly driven by Singapore. And Singapore has just really gone through the roof as they've had such a limited amount of new capacity available. And again, similar to what we saw on the energy side, U.S. has lagged at more competitive levels. So you see a similarity, but rather than really going back down like energy prices are, we're still sort of in that upswing. One of the things we ask our respondents in our survey on a biannual basis is what kind of movement they expect to see in colocation rates over the next 12 months. So if you look at these comparisons of what we saw in the first half of 2023 versus the second half, there's been a slight decrease in the average expected inflation rate for colo, but you've also see a dramatic decrease in the outliers. On the cross-connect side, you actually see an average expectations increasing for higher inflation in the next 12 months. And I think, again, that's due to some of this hiding of overall costs in other portions of the contracts. So a lot of information on a couple different things, but just in terms of tying it all together, again, I think that between the difficulty in finding new power sources, especially as we need more and more power with generative AI, that's propelling us to look to new markets increasingly. As even though inflation is slowing, we're still dealing with high colocation costs in core markets, and that's probably going to ultimately cause us to propel us a bit to look elsewhere as well. And a great example of this is what we see happening in Asia, as we see tremendous amounts of new development across the North, the Southeast, and South Asia. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. You can leave now. We're done. Thanks very much.